Well, hello there, guys. Welcome to the posing characters tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to go over my own approach on how I go about drawing poses. I actually used to have a really hard time drawing poses until I learned these steps. The first 3 steps in particular totally changed my experience on drawing poses and made me actually be able to draw them without it looking really stiff and weird. So I hope that you find these tips helpful. Let's get started. The first step is to draw a line of action. A line of action is 1 or sometimes 2 lines that show the overall flow of a pose. You can see here as I identify a line of action in these photos of poses. So drawing over photos like this is a good way to train your eye to help find that flow through the body. So, don't hesitate to take some interesting poses that you like and just challenge your mind by finding the line of action that flows through that photo. If you have a hard time finding the line of action in a pose, you can try and think about how the spine is curving and how it would look if that line from the spine continued to flow through the body. This is not always entirely accurate, depending on the pose, but it can be a good place to start wrapping your brain around the concept. Now, if you do not start with a line of action, it can be really easy to fall into the trap of having a very stiff looking pose. So make sure that you do not skip this step. You can start by drawing a simple swooshing line for an interesting and flowing pose. Step 2 is the angle of the hips. So once you have the line of action, draw the angle of the hips. If this is a standing pose, remember that the hip that is bearing weight will be higher than the opposite hip. You only need 1 line here. No need to get detailed. Just find an angled line that represents the tilt of the hips. That's all you're looking for right here. So again, you can practice figuring that kind of thing out by looking at photos of people and drawing over top, just to get used to finding that angle in the human body. So yeah, super simple, just adding the angle of the hips to our swooshy line of action. Step 3. Very similar to step 2, but this time we are angling the shoulders instead of the hips. So now you can draw the angle of the shoulders. Again, keep it simple, just 1 line. And also, very important to remember that the angle of the shoulders and the angle of the hips are usually opposite of each other. So it's pretty rare that you will find a pose where the hips and shoulders are parallel angled the same way. They're almost always angled opposite, kind of towards each other. So I accidentally forgot to find the angle of her hips in the last step, so I had to hurry and do that. But here you can see that her hair kind of makes an illusion that her screen left shoulder is higher than the other. You can't really see what's happening there. But because I know the angle of her hips, I know that actually her screen left shoulder, upon looking a little bit closer, is lower than her screen right shoulder. And I really know that because the angle of her hips are opposite and really tell me that. So now I'm just drawing the angle of the shoulders, just a simple line. And you can see that it's not even lined up quite with the line of action. That's because the line of action isn't necessarily the spine. This is just a flow of the pose. Step 4, add a boxy shape to the torso. Or for me, I tend to just add a line from the shoulders to the waist to the hips on both sides to kind of figure out what's happening in the torso. How prominent that waist is and the dip there is going to be different depending on the body shape, obviously, and it's going to be a lot more pronounced, that's the word, in females than males. So keep that in mind when you're doing this step. Step 5 is stick figure lines for legs. At this point, I generally still like to just draw lines for legs. I'm keeping everything very simple and try not to add more than just stick figure lines or simple shapes. To keep the flow of the pose, I generally do not like to draw straight lines for legs and arms, even though they are technically stiff bones. This is just personal preference, but I find it easier to see the flow of the pose if there are some curves throughout the pose. A kind of cheat sheet for this is the top of the thigh will be curved and then the back of the calf will be curved. And that's generally what I like to follow. Sometimes, as you can see on this screen left leg, I will just curve down the whole leg and kind of indicate where the knee is. That's also something that you can do if it's appropriate for the pose. Step 6, stick figure arms. Same as step 5, but this time for the arms. I find that finding good arm poses can be pretty challenging. So this could be a good opportunity to create a new layer and test out different arm poses. Feel free to move them around and stuff with the transform tool if you need to. It's also at this step that I usually like to add circles to indicate the shoulders and maybe add a little indication of the curve or angle of the collarbone. Step 7, draw an oval for the head. When I do rough gesture drawing, I usually pay very little attention to the head early on. At this point, I just draw a simple oval for the head to figure out the angle that I want it to be at. Usually I draw this oval too big or too small, so I use the lasso tool to select what I drew and then use the free transform tool, Control T is the shortcut for that, to resize and rotate the head to be the right size and the right angle. Step 8, start to fill in the body with simple shapes. So at this point, I'm just starting to add more volume with simple shapes to the body. Simple cylinders for arms, legs, and triangle-like shapes for feet and hands. Again, try and maintain the flow even as you're adding these shapes. At this stage, I'm still staying super loose and sketchy, but that is just fine at this early stage, and it's better to maintain the loose flow than to get too stiff too early. Step 9, make any adjustments that you need. This step is kind of mixed in, I would say, with step 8. You can do this kind of at the same time as you're adding in more shapes. But this step is just to tell you to make sure you're looking at proportions of things and feel free to make any of the adjustments that you need. Again, the lasso tool, if you're working digitally, plus the free transform tool is really your best friend here. So just picking up parts of your drawing that need to be adjusted with the lasso tool, and then Control T to free transform, rotate, scale, do whatever you need to do to make the proportions line up correctly. Step 10, fill in the details. So from this point, you should have a fairly solid base or foundation for your pose. So you can start adding details and refining your drawing. Maybe this will require an extra sketching step to figure out more of the anatomy that's actually happening beyond the just general gesture, and that's fine. We're not going to go over specifics of anatomy in this tutorial because that would take a very long time. And this tutorial is just specifically on finding poses. But just remember when you're starting to fill in your drawing and find more of the details to keep that general spirit and sense of flow that you got in your initial gesture and line of action. That is the most important thing here. Something that is important to do at this stage is if you ever feel unsure about a piece of anatomy as you are filling it in, make sure to either look up reference or take your own reference to figure that out. There are lots of times where a pose is really good or the general idea is really good, but then a specific part of anatomy is really off, and that could have easily been fixed if the artist had just taken the time to find some reference and see how that specific piece of anatomy works in that specific pose. It's not a terribly hard thing to do, and you learn a lot by doing that while you're working through this process. So make sure to do that. It will make you a better artist. And I am not the type of artist that will sit down and just study anatomy from an anatomy textbook. I really have only learned anatomy through gesture drawing and through just learning as needed. Whenever I don't know how to draw something, I'll look up pictures of what that specific part of anatomy looks like. And that is really how I've learned the anatomy that I do know. I'm not claiming to be a super expert at it, but it is a good way to progress and not get too bored, is just noticing what you're having trouble with, what you don't understand, and then learning how to do that as you come across it. So this was kind of a funny part in the process. I noticed that her screen left leg seemed a little bit shorter. So what I did was I grabbed it with the lasso tool and I held it up against the other leg, and sure enough, it was shorter. So that's an easy way to check your anatomy. And then what I just did with both of the legs is I grabbed them to check how tall they are against the torso, because generally you want the legs and the torso plus the head to be about the same height if you compare. So those kind of little checks can really help you out with your proportions. So at this point in the tutorial, I'm going to speed up the video a little more, turn on some music, and let you watch as I start refining the drawing and adding more line art type stuff, and just finishing this drawing out. So happy watching. bet you thought you were done with me. Silly you. I always have more crap to say. Anyway, I just wanted to tell you that the best way to improve at drawing poses is by practice, and specifically by practicing figure drawing, and even more specifically, gesture drawing. So if you don't know what gesture drawing is when you draw really quick 10-second to 5-minute poses from either a live model or a photo of a model. The quick time allows the model to do more dynamic poses for you to practice drawing. You can also practice gesture drawing by just going out in public and observing people. They're not going to stand still for you, but that's okay for gesture drawing. You don't need an absolutely still model. The point is to just capture the motion and the general flow of the pose, just like we've been talking about for this whole tutorial. So some ideas of places you could go to practice your gesture drawing skills. You could go to a mall, public transit, a cafe, the park, a sports game, a dance class, or really any public place. Just remember to try and be a little discreet. We don't want to creep people out too much. When you are practicing drawing poses, you don't have to be super invested in every single pose. Just stay loose with your drawings and draw lots of poses in a short amount of time. Once you have multiple poses drawn, you can always go back later, look over them, and if you have one or two that you really like, you can work at refining those poses and turning them into a full character drawing. I hope this helps. Thank you so much for watching, and a super special shout out to my lovely patrons for making this tutorial possible. Happy drawing. Your pal, Chrisabug. Is that how you end a video? Do I sign it like a letter? I don't know. I don't make very many videos. This is new to me. Have a good day, guys. Happy drawing.